it is more important than ever to have a quality procurement opportunity out there, just as much as it's important to have as many suppliers bid on your procurement opportunities. So one thing that has been happening quite a bit, and particularly if you're in public sector. Now, we know in public sector, RFPs make the world go round. There's tons of them. In my personal opinion, sometimes things go out as RFPs that shouldn't be an RFP. But I digress. That's another topic for another day. What we are finding is that you need to put out the right type of RFP if you are going to do one. So do you go out with non-binding? Do you go out with, like your contract A, contract B scenario? Or if you're going out with a negotiated RFP, do you do a standard one or do you do a multi-stage one? So let's talk about what are some of the pros and cons of doing a multi-stage RFP as opposed to a standard one. The first point is that multi-stage RFPs are actually extremely time consuming. There's multiple rounds like pre-quals, presentations, the negotiations itself, right? And it just takes a lot of time as compared to a standard one, which is basically like a single phase. There isn't a pre-qual aspect. It's like you put the thing on the market, you get your proposals, you evaluate. Your evaluations might have multiple stages in it, but at the end of the day, you don't pre-qual and then shortlist and then maybe have competitive dialogue, that kind of thing. So it's a huge disadvantage to you if you're under time constraints to run a multi-stage RFP. So particularly in large-scale IT projects as well, where there's so many stakeholders and oftentimes budgets have to be spent and all of that, it can really delay the decision-making process and subsequent implementation that you're like furiously working towards. Another thing that could be considered a disadvantage for a multi-stage RFP is that it really requires a lot more resources to run it. So because you also have a huge time commitment, you also need the right people on your team in order to be able to run the RFP. Not everybody is going to be the right fit for the different stages of a multi-stage RFP. So, for example, you might have someone like me run the procurement process from end to end, but you also have to ensure that you've got someone who can make management related decisions, senior or otherwise. You need to have the right legal, not only one who understands the procurement process, but someone who understands the actual scope of what you're procuring for. And IT is a whole different ballgame to consider. And then you have your subject matter experts. You have, the various business areas. You have stakeholders. You've got to have the right people to evaluate proposals. So it takes a village, as they say, right, to run these multi-stage RFPs. So again, if you've got time constraints or you are challenged with a smaller team, you're going to have to consider that. And if you don't have a team in-house, that in itself may be another procurement where you have to hire external resourcing to help you run the process. Another disadvantage to a multi-stage RFP is supplier fatigue. Like, just as it's a time and resource commitment for your own company, it's also a time and resource commitment for, the supplier community. So they may become tired of the multiple steps because it's taking so long, and it might lead them to have reduced engagement, up to and even including withdrawal from the process, because they are allowed to do that. The more stages that there are in an RFP process, it's the higher the chances are that they might lose interest or feel like their investment in the process is excessive, particularly if they have no clear indication on whether or not they'll be the successful vendor. And speaking of supplier fatigue, that leads us to complexity. So because the process can be complex, that could lead them to supplier fatigue. But it's also just simply coordination of all these rounds that you go through, the evaluation, like competitive dialogue, like I mentioned before, and then just coordinating all the internal and external pieces. It can really be a lot. The standard RFP, on the other hand, is a lot easier to manage because it's got less moving parts in it. And logistically, it can also be a lot easier as well. Generally, when you see a lot of multi-stage RFPs, it's because you need to bring people on site to see something. For example, I've procured implementation services for solutions, and you want suppliers to be able to view a piece of clean code. You've got to bring them on site for those code sessions. So that in itself is logistically challenging, particularly when you live in the day and age where remote work is king, right? So let's talk about higher costs. Multi-stage RFPs are a lot more costly because there's a lot more moving parts, there's a lot more rounds, there's a lot more time and effort that's required, not only from procurement and also the suppliers. Everyone involved, there's a cost of doing business attached to it. So not only can it lead to higher costs for the organization, but it will also result in higher costs for the vendor community because they've got to pay the appropriate amount to participate in the process. So maybe they need to hire their own resources to be able to put their proposal together, or they have to hire more subcontractors. So that is something very significant that they have to take into consideration. One of the key things that you have to consider when you run a multi-stage RFP as compared to a standard one is that you run the risk of overcomplicating the process. So you have to think about whether or not running a procurement with all of these stages really adds significant value overall. So also the challenge of running something with all of these stages is that sometimes you get people into the process. Remember, I talked about all of these additional resources. Sometimes suppliers might feel like they don't get to bring the real people of value until down the line. But then there's no guarantee that they're going to get that far, right? So you have to consider whether or not you're getting the best team you can get participating in this process right from the get-go, and you have to make it worth its while. I think a lot of people use a multi-stage RFP as an opportunity to just negotiate their way through the whole thing and try and get the upper hand, particularly the procuring entity, but that's not necessarily the case. Complicating the process is not necessarily going to get you a better deal because you have to consider what your decision points are, what needs to be integrated, who's involved. There's a lot of moving parts and considerations that you have to factor in to these processes. So if something is standard, uncomplicated, you're going to want to consider if you want to go through something as complex as this process, particularly when you can't really see the ultimate value arising out of it. As compared to a standard RFP, where suppliers submit their full proposal all in the first round, and you get to consider the best possible solution up front. So to sum it up, a multi-stage RFP can really provide a more in-depth evaluation, but it also really introduces challenges related to time, complexity, as well as resource intensity. So choose wisely.